Welcome to the Global Lane. I'm Gary Lane. On today's Where in the World, CBN News reporter Lucille Talusan will talk about North Korea's tough nuclear stance. And from the home front, Christine Douglas Williams of Jihad Watch joins us to talk about protecting the West from returning ISIS fighters. Next on Set It Straight, reporter Nikita Vladimirov from Campus Reform. He'll talk to us about Venezuela and while socialism doesn't match with the U.S. system of government, despite what Bernie Sanders might say. And stay tuned for Driving It Home, where I explain what Trump's fire and fury strategy will be against North Korea. And it all starts right now, right here on the Global Lane. Up front on the Global Lane, a big win for President Trump at the United Nations this week, when Ambassador Nikki Haley and her team convinced China, Russia, and about a dozen other members of the UN Security Council to approve $1 billion in economic sanctions against North Korea. It was one of the toughest sanction resolutions passed in a generation. A unanimous vote of the Security Council is a rare thing. It's hard to get most members to agree on anything, unless it's denouncing Israel. But anyway, Haley personally thanked China for its role and said the sanctions vote was an important one, but
we should not fool ourselves into thinking we have solved the problem. Not even close.
And just hours after the UN vote, North Korea responded defiantly, saying it will never give up its ballistic missile and nuclear programs, and if the United States attacks it militarily, it will teach the U.S. a severe lesson and respond with nuclear weapons. Well, the Washington Post reported North Korea has crossed a new threshold and can now place a miniature nuclear warhead that can fit inside a missile, and they may have 60 of them. Fox and Friends reported a U.S. spy satellite photographed 2 anti-ship cruise missiles being loaded by North Korea onto a patrol boat. Now, this is how President Trump responded with a message to madman Kim Jong-un.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
North Korea responded to that, saying it may launch a missile strike on U.S. military bases in Guam. 150,000 Americans are there. Well, joining us now with more is CBN News national security correspondent Erik Rosales in Washington. George Thomas is here at CBN headquarters. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today.
Sure.
Erik, is this just rhetoric, or is this really a serious threat of war? What do you think?
No, I believe that this is a very serious threat of war. It's a threat of war that could actually happen within the next couple of weeks. We're in the process of having a number of carriers out there in the Sea of Japan. We have the USS Ronald Reagan along with a number of destroyers and carriers, and I believe that a preemptive strike might actually take place.
Now, Trump said fire and fury will be unleashed. What's he referring to? A nuclear strike, tactical nuke, something else?
What I'm hearing from the Pentagon, at least from sources that I'm talking with, we could actually see a very quick response, one that would actually involve missiles, Tomahawk missiles that would be taken off from the different carriers and destroyers that are out there in the Pacific and would hit them and hit them hard because, as you mentioned, they do have 60 missiles that we know of, and some of those missiles could actually be taken off. Of course, many of them would actually go into the South Korea area, but of course, some of them might even hit us here in the mainland.
Maybe some stealth fighters there going in over the border to take out some of the artillery?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to see that. Something similar to what we saw possibly even in the Gulf War, something like that.
George, now you've been to the border between North and South Korea. How might the UN respond? I mean, North Korea is not that far from Seoul.
That's right, Gary. Less than 35 miles from the DMZ, known as the Demilitarized Zone, one of the most dangerous borders in the entire world. Now, let me tell you, Gary, I was just in Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, a few weeks ago, and it's business as usual. You know, you have to realize that the South Koreans have been dealing with this bellicose rhetoric from North Korea for decades, and they are used to it. But let me just lay out a scenario. Say, for example, North Korea has always said that they will only respond if there was a preemptive attack. They would not be the one to start the war. So in what sort of capacity can the North Koreans respond? Now, putting aside their ballistic missile capabilities, most of their conventional artillery is located right there on the DMZ, and I said that's only about 35 miles to downtown Seoul. So a massive, what you could see is a massive artillery barrage on the South Korean capital. And some estimates are, there was one study done by the Atlantic magazine in 2005, and some estimates are about 100,000 South Koreans could lose their lives. The nature of this artillery weapons along the border is very difficult because the U.S. once you launch a rocket launcher or a cannon, you immediately expose yourself. So the North Koreans have to make the calculation that if they did do an all-out artillery assault, they make their positions vulnerable to the U.S., to Japan, to South Korea. But listen, let me just sort of say something here. The North Koreans are masters of bringing the world to the brink of war. And Kim Jong-un realizes that there is a new sheriff in Washington, D.C., and he wants to test this new administration 200-plus days into its office.
Eric, I understand that Mad Dog Mattis had some words for Kim Jong-un. What did he say?
He did. He was discussing, in fact, that if North Korea does not stop its nuclear program, then the country and its people will face the consequences. So the very, very strong words from General Mattis, and this is what we're hearing.
Eric, what do you think from talking to your sources at the Pentagon and elsewhere in Washington? Is this going to get worse, or are we going to see some diplomacy now, resumption of talks to defuse this crisis?
Well, the ball is definitely in the court of Kim Jong-un. He actually has to stop with this nuclear program. If he does not stop in the nuclear program, like I said, the line has been made, and we are going to have to act on some of these situations that President Trump is talking about.
Very decisive red line, and our president means business, doesn't he? George,
he certainly does.
Your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think I look back to history, and history shows us that this regime has brought the world to the brink of war and then has backed off. And my sense is that Kim Jong-un is testing this new administration because he knows that the consequences of war would be devastating. You have 28,000 troops just across the DMZ on the South Korean side. The United States will unleash hell on North Korea, and the regime will collapse. It would take some time. Thousands of people will lose their lives. Kim Jong-un would be removed, perhaps even killed. The last thing he wants is that. And I think my sense is that he's testing this new regime, wants to bring them to the brink. And the reality is that in the middle of that, he continues to develop nuclear capabilities. And I think what Kim Jong-un is doing and sending to the rest of the world is, you are not going to do to me what you did to Muammar Gaddafi, to Saddam Hussein, and potentially to Bashar al-Assad. That's not going to happen in Pyongyang.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll have to wait and see what does happen, and I know you guys will keep us on top of it. Erik Rosales, thanks for joining us from Washington. George Thomas, as always, we appreciate your insights.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Gary.
And as you know, there's been a lot of activity on the diplomatic home front with America's allies, not only at the UN, but also in Southeast Asia, where Secretary of State Tillerson met with leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Manila. And that's the subject of this week's Where in the World. Our CBN News Asia correspondent Lucille Talusan joins us via Skype from Manila. Lucille, this was the 50th anniversary event for ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I know economic and trade issues were on the agenda, but North Korea dominated those meetings. What was the concern expressed by the ASEAN countries?
During their speeches, they expressed their concern over the escalating tension on the Korean Peninsula.
China seemed to play a big role with some very strong statements about North Korea. What did the Chinese foreign minister say?
Mhm. Well, Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a closed-door meeting with North Korean Foreign Minister Ri, and Wang Yi was telling North Korean minister to obey and to abide by the rules being given by the United Nations, and for them to stop developing their the missiles and stop launching missile testing.
So maybe President Trump is finally getting out of the Chinese what he's looking for, them putting pressure on North Korea, in addition to that UN vote imposing sanctions. Well, Tillerson,
Yes.
I know, also met with your president, Philippine President Duterte, and expressed his willingness to cooperate and help your country with its fight against ISIS terrorists in southern Philippines. And I know you were down there not too long ago in Mindanao. What might happen there? How will the U.S. help?
Recently, the Pentagon is suggesting that they can launch airstrikes in the Philippines. The U.S. will be not only helping in terms of sharing intelligence and training, but they themselves will launch the airstrikes against the ISIS. Well, at first we called them ISIS-linked, the multi-group, but now I'm surprised that we are already referring to them as ISIS. So the problem there is really very serious, and this is the third month, Gary, of the battle in Marawi.
Okay, well, we'll wait and see on that. And I can't let you go, Lucille, without asking about Secretary Tillerson's visit to the U.S. military cemetery in Manila. Now, he placed a wreath in honor of America's fallen soldiers from World War II. How significant and important was that visit, Lucille, for both our country and for the people of the Philippines?
Well, it's very significant. There are around more than 17,000 headstones in that cemetery, and headstones of American soldiers who died, and around 36,000 missing. And so it's really very significant, and it just shows how Americans would really fight for freedom, and how Americans fought for the freedom of the Philippines. And actually, Gary, in the guest book, Secretary Tillerson wrote, "Let us never forget freedom." And this is very indicative of what the Americans or the U.S. Is willing to do. The Americans are willing to die for freedom.
And it shows a close relationship with the Philippines, does it not, that we've had for many, many years. Lucille Talusan, our correspondent in Manila, thank you for joining us. Iceland may not be the #1 place you think of when it comes to the Islamic religion, but it is there, alive and well. Christine Douglas Williams is a writer for Jihad Watch, an international award-winning broadcast journalist and author of the most recent book, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam. Douglas was almost run over by a car in Iceland and witnessed Dr. Robert Spencer, another key figure in the counter-jihad movement, get poisoned. She's with us now to dive into this topic even further. Christine, thank you so much for joining us today. So why is this happening in Iceland, of all places, and has it gone too far to get a handle on?
It's difficult to know exactly why this specifically is happening in Iceland, but I will say that Iceland has a history of some powerful social justice warriors. It was only after we finally left Iceland that emails went back and forth. And one of the social justice warriors there that called himself a reporter was actually calling up the Canadian government against me to make all kinds of complaints that Christine Douglas Williams is on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and she's racist against Muslims, which could not be further from the truth. This is why I've written a book about Muslims, in favor of Muslims modernizing. But this was happening, and I got a letter from one of the organizers of the event that invited Robert Spencer and myself to Iceland with a group called VACR, the Preservation of European Culture. They're not remotely racist people, very friendly people, but they are concerned about the pattern of what's going on in Europe. And then I found out afterward through those letters trying to defend me that is a history in Iceland, trying to shut down free speech and attack people that's considered on the right side of the spectrum, both media and politicians alike, to the point of becoming dangerous and harmful.
Okay, you wrote a letter back in May There was a warning to Icelanders, and you said, quote, "Many friendly, seemingly moderate Muslims are deceiving you. You already have a mosque in your tiny country that is funded by Saudi Arabia, a country that advocates Wahhabism, which is militant Islam. Is the same thing happening in America?"
Yes, it is. It's happening all over America. When one goes back and recalls the Holy Land Foundation trial and the unindicted co-conspirators and the many mainstream Muslim organizations that can be traced right back to their founding to the Muslim Brotherhood and or Hamas, the same thing is going on in America, what makes Iceland so particularly dangerous for the people and the progress that's happening there is because it's a very sparsely populated land, and the land is very vast. So when you look at the strategic position of Iceland sitting between Europe and North America, it's no wonder that it is a target for Islamists. One of the main mosques, the imam was there, and he was trying to tie up the speeches of both myself and Robert Spencer. And as it turns out, after, when many people thought we were hard on the imam, as it turns out, his mosque is funded by Saudi Arabia. Another one is going up right in the capital, Reykjavik, that is funded also by Saudi Arabia, and it's on a hill as you drive in, as if to declare, well, this is our territory. And in addition to that, that same imam came out after the London Bridge attacks and declared that it was an inside job and it was faked.
Christine, you know, I find it puzzling, and I'm sure many people do, that a tiny country of only about 300,000 people has one mosque and another one going up. I mean, is there a large Muslim population there?
There is a growing Muslim population there, but the one thing, again, that worries me about that country is that it will not be difficult to overtake, precisely because of the sparse population there. So with this increase in Muslim immigration coming in, again, without the vetting of the kinds of Muslim immigrants, and given the mosque that's there already, and the kind of imam, and the other one going up that's funded by Saudi Arabia, there is reason for grave concern.
Well, aren't the people of Iceland concerned about this? I mean, obviously, people who stand up to this and want to preserve Western culture and civilization are deemed Islamophobes. I mean, are they afraid of that, or what's the problem?
The atmosphere in Iceland is one of, we don't really pay attention enough to what's going on, which is sadly everywhere. They live in peace, they're friendly. The West, what makes the West so prone to being victimized by stealth jihadists and jihadists that are coming in is that they're easily fooled by the friendly faces, the smiles, if one actually picks up the memorandum, the Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America, you would see how devious it is, and it talks in detail about infiltrating the country that is the target country, which is deemed the house of war, to be subjugated and brought out as under the House of Islam.
You were almost run over by a car. Tell us what happened, and it wasn't from Muslims. These were leftists, were they not?
I'm standing outside waiting, and off my peripheral vision, I see this vehicle coming up behind me, and had I not jumped out of the way, he would have knocked me over. When Robert came out in the parking lot and was waiting and his back was turned, the guy made an about face in the parking lot, and the same thing almost happened to Robert. We went back into the hotel to sit in the lobby. Next thing, we're looking outside, and the guy came out of his vehicle and he's walking fast toward the building. So we just made an exit and went to another part of the building, and nothing else happened beyond that, except that we finally went to the venue, did the speeches. They were successful, they went very well, and then we just decided to go out for drinks, and Robert's drink was poisoned.
What's the danger to the West from these jihadists that are now returning home or seeking other battles to fight elsewhere?
One need only look up the words in a search engine, ISIS infiltration of the West, and we will see the reports that we are already infiltrated by ISIS. They have promised that they intended to infiltrate. Why are Western leaders not believing the warnings that are being told to them?
Okay, Christine Douglas Williams, we appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Is socialism the best system for the United States? Bernie Sanders hailed Venezuela as being a place that is more suitable for the American dream. Well, as riots go on, and as people are starving and dying, some actually disagree with that notion. And here to talk about socialism and how it ruins nations like Venezuela is Campus Reform's Nikita Vladimirov, who also happens to be from Russia. Nikita, can you explain to us what the liberal fascination is with implementing a socialist government?
So unfortunately, politicians like Bernie Sanders seem to very much prefer a system of democratic socialism. Now, this is a sleight of hand that is often played by the Democrats because, unfortunately, this is socialist cherry-picking because Bernie Sanders focuses on countries such as Denmark, a very small countries that are members of the European Union that implement risk-free policies because their European comrades are going to bail them out if there is ever a problem. And they, for some reason, think that it is appropriate to advocate for those policies to be implemented on the federal level here in the United States. Now, of course, countries such as Russia and Venezuela, where the same policies have been tried on a much larger scale, demonstrate that they result in catastrophic socioeconomic failure.
Nikita, we'll be right back with you, but let's go ahead and hear what Bernie Sanders had to say about a single-payer health care system and Fidel Castro in Cuba.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I am talking about Medicare, a single-payer health care system for the elderly. And in my view, we should expand that concept to all people. I believe that everybody in this country should be entitled to health care as a right, and the most effective way to do it is through a Medicare for all single-payer program.
In, 1961, they invaded Cuba. And everybody was totally convinced that Castro was the worst guy in the world, that all the Cuban people were going to rise up in rebellion against Fidel Castro. They had forgot that he educated their kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
Nikita, you come from a communist nation, communist Russia. What is a single health care system like, and what are the major differences between our two systems of government?
The healthcare system, particularly when it's government-run, is absolutely disastrous. In Russia, I've had several family members that cannot get healthcare whenever they get older. I have my grandmother who was in a hospital just now, and she's struggling to find doctors that are willing to treat her in a timely manner. It is a massive, massive problem. Now, in the United States, you have the opportunity to have your healthcare through a private market, which, in my view, is a much better solution to a very big problem. I would say this about the differences of government. In Russia, everything is government-run. All the market systems are taken over by the government if they show any signs of inefficiency. And I think that has to be opposed. We cannot have the same type of approach to various problems in the free market in the United States, because once you cross that boundary, once you cross that line, there is no going back. Government just continues to grow and get bigger and bigger.
And I know people that I've talked to in Russia and also when I was in Cuba tell me that there are long wait times and the quality just isn't there because there's no competition. So why isn't the media not speaking out against socialist governments, and especially the one in Venezuela that is about to crash down?
Yeah, there's a very interesting history of this. If you remember, during the very multiple atrocities that were committed under the Soviet Union, the media also responded in a very similar way. They sort of said, well, maybe this is not true socialism. And I think part of that does come from the politicians here who advocate for those type of models, for those type of political systems. But another part, I think, is also academia. We see this sort of thing all the time at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, to where professors openly advocate for Marxism. And as a result of that, many millennial students today view the system of socialism in a very positive light.
Well, I know in the last election, many millennials were, yeah, Bernie Sanders. And then you say, you know, he's a socialist. And they say, yeah. And then you ask them what socialism is, and they couldn't even tell you. So do you have any words of wisdom to some millennials that think they might like socialism?
Well, first of all, the term democratic socialism, which again Bernie Sanders uses very frequently, is not a new term. It's not a progressive term. Matter of fact, the Soviet Constitution of 1977 mentions the word democratic at least 7 times. So every time I hear it, to me this is a sense of déjà vu. I think, well, you know, my former compatriots, my country of birth, has already implemented almost every single policy that Bernie Sanders has previously discussed. And I also would certainly advocate for a much better understanding of the founding principles in the United States. You have a very, very extraordinary literature when it comes to political philosophy upon which this country has been founded. So I would certainly advocate that we study that literature more extensively.
Okay, Nikita Vladimirov from Campus Reform. We always appreciate your insights, and this one, personal experience with socialism in Russia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Fire and fury. That's what President Trump has pledged to unleash on North Korea if madman Kim Jong-un doesn't stop threatening the United States. Now, it sure sounds like the beat of war drums to me, doesn't it to you? Why is Trump ratcheting up the rhetoric? Let's take a look at some of the facts that we know. Since October 2006, North Korea has conducted 5 nuclear weapons tests. The most recent was about a year ago. Pyongyang said it successfully tested a device at that time that could be mounted onto a rocket. It's estimated the maximum yield of North Korea's nuclear weapon capabilities may be as much as 30 kilotons. We also know its most recent ballistic missile test launch had a range of about 2,300 miles. If on a different trajectory, it could have hit the western U.S. Now, remember this one. The hydrogen bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima 72 years ago was 15 kilotons. So we know the devastation of that. A North Korean nuclear bomb could be twice as deadly, at least. And Madman Un is getting closer to making good on his threats. Should we just sit and wait until Guam, the people of Honolulu, Anchorage, L.A., or Denver are incinerated? If the United States takes military action, either alone or in concert with our allies, the result would likely be, as President Trump says, one that would unleash fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never known. So let's just sit down and talk, you say. Well, yes, we'd all like that, wouldn't we? But how do you talk reasonably to a madman? Now, in the past, the Kim family has never kept its promises and commitments. Since its first test in October 2006, North Korea has pursued a policy of talks, testing, stop testing, negotiated agreements, sanctions lifted, violations, more sanctions, more talks, sanctions lifted. The Kims have repeatedly used the excuse of the U.S. military threat to slowly creep towards development of nuclear weapons and advanced ballistic missile delivery systems. So guess what? If our intelligence is correct, they finally arrived. They can now place a small nuclear device on a rocket and send it to the United States or anywhere in the East Asian region. And they've just threatened Guam. That's a U.S. territory, 150,000 people there. For 30 years, the West has kicked the can down the road. We talk, they test. We impose sanctions, they halt development. We lift sanctions and make monetary concessions, they resume testing. And on it goes. But the day of reckoning may soon be here. Now let's pray and hope for peace. Let's not grow weary of that, because the alternative is, as President Trump warns, fire and fury. Let's pray for wise decisions to be made by our president and other world leaders. In 1 Peter 3:12, we're told that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. May we seek God's will. May he hear our prayers. And may his will, not ours, be done against those who do evil. Well, that's it for the Global Lane this week. We'll see you next time. Be blessed.